Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This video provides a short introduction to the history of the first mosques in North America. During the first centuries of the European colonization of North America, countless West African Muslims were forced to leave their homelands and were transported to a lifetime of slavery. They brought their faith with them. Indeed, not a few were educated ulama and imams, which they practiced as best they could. They prayed in their slave quarters or in the fields where they toiled, but were never permitted mosques in which to pray, in which to gather for worship. Following the final abolition of slavery in North America in 1865, this situation continued, although numbers of emancipated former Muslim slaves lived well into the 1930s. They were only ever able to pray in their domestic environment. In the late 19th century and first decades of the 20th century, other Muslims traveled across the Atlantic to the United States and Canada. This time they were propelled not by compulsion, but by the freedom to seek new opportunities. One group was from Lebanon, who was searching for work, while the other was from the Baltic regions, the first wave of which, together with their Jewish compatriots, was fleeing religious persecution. Both groups were classed as white, unlike Muslims from most other regions of the world, and thus permitted entry by immigration authorities in the United States. They settled in cities and in rural communities and began to adapt themselves to a new society. In this process, the venerable Islamic institution of the mosque played an important role as a familiar setting which provided community support and education, as well as a place to worship. The first mosque recorded to have been built in North America was outside the little rural community of Ross in North Dakota, United States, in 1929. The creation of immigrants from Lebanon who first began arriving at the turn of the century, with other pioneers, to farm the wide open prairies. The simple building was built semi-underground without any specific external Islamic features. The local Muslim graveyard, however, developed around it. Demolished in the 1970s, it was later replaced in 2005 by the descendants of the original mosque builders by a tiny new building in a stereotypic Islamic style, situated in a quiet residential neighborhood in rural Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in the United States, is the oldest surviving purpose-built mosque in North America. Also built by Muslim settlers from Lebanon, it is commonly known as the Mother Mosque of America. This modest place of worship was used until a larger local mosque was built in 1971, when it was sold and gradually fell into disrepair. In 1991, the Islamic Council of Iowa purchased the original building, which was restored by the local community of believers to function once again as a flourishing center of Muslim faith and community life. The mosque is listed in the United States National Register of Historic Places and the State Historical Register of Iowa as an essential piece of American religious history, which symbolizes tolerance and acceptance of Islam and Muslims in the United States of America. The restoration of the early 1990s altered some of its original features, however, notably the dome over the entrance, which comfortably evoked the architecture of the original builders' homelands in Lebanon. In 1938, 4 years after the Cedar Rapids Mosque was built, other Lebanese immigrants built the Al Rashid Mosque in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, the first in the country. It is a medium-sized red brick building with a gable roof and two modest minarets flanking the entrance. It is no longer in its original situation having been relocated in 1991 to the open-air museum of Fort Edmonton Park to save it from demolition after the opening of a much larger mosque of the same name in 1982. As the historic structure now stands, the form of its minarets has been changed, and the original dome on top of the gable above the entrance is missing. In 1931, the Lithuanian Tatar Society, later known as the American Mohammedan Society, an immigrant community of Baltic Tatar Muslims, purchased a former Protestant church in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, a suburb of New York City, which they had been renting for worship and community gatherings for over a decade. Now their property, it was formally converted into the Brooklyn Muslim Mosque. For the Baltic Tatar congregation coming from Belarus, Poland, as well as Lithuania, the choice of such a building was natural, as for centuries they had worshipped in wooden buildings of similar architectural form. All the church now needed was to panel its brick walls with wood and to place a small symbolic minaret turret with a crescent alem on the peak of its gable facade. The interior was also lined with wood, carpeted and provided with a minbar and a partition which separated male and female worships as in their homeland. The Little Brooklyn Mosque played an important role in the settlers' transition to their new life. The historian Tariq Hussein, who together with others in the now independent Baltic states has done much to inform us of their precious Muslim cultural heritage, provides us with evocative recollections from the mosque's congregation. An example is, a lot of the people that came here sponsored one another. They lived in each other's homes. They came not speaking English and spoke a combination of Polish and Russian. It was very difficult for them to assimilate at that point, but the mosque helped. It was the bridge. This was a group of people determined to make a life in the United States. And this mosque's original purpose was to help and support one another religiously and socially. In 1952, the USA News Review published an article which conveys the mosque congregation's strong faith and community spirit. The neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, in which the American Mohammedan Society Mosque stands, is very much like thousands of others all over the United States. On all sides are modest, comfortable houses in which families live. In the evening, the children play games on the sidewalk, running, laughing and shouting as they do all over the world. But some Friday evenings are different. 20 or 25 of these neighborhood children are assembled in the mosque's large, well-lit lower room. Seated at long study tables, they are attentive and serious, for they are learning to read and write Arabic so that they may understand the Quran and follow the faith of their fathers. Before them are simple texts and workbooks in which they are learning to form Arabic characters. In later life, one of these children recalled, "All the community would gather here. My mother didn't drive, and although we lived 40 kilometers away, we would take a cab, a train, a bus, and then walk just to be here. My father, who worked in Brooklyn, would then join us. The adults would have prayers, and then the younger people would have classes. In the 1960s, when I was growing up, this place was packed. It was just unbelievable. We were very, very close. Everyone was an aunt or an uncle, even though they were not blood relatives. It was a very tight community." Soviet assumption of control over the Baltic states and Poland following World War II put a halt to any new arrivals from the Baltic Tatar homelands. During this difficult period, the Brooklyn Mosque served Baltic Muslims throughout the diaspora as well as their homelands as a reassuring symbol of hope and of the eternity of their faith. Today, although the Brooklyn Muslim Mosque is carefully maintained, it has no regular congregation as the first generations of Baltic Muslims assimilated into American society and moved elsewhere, It now opens mainly for the religious festivals of Eid al-Fitr, Eid al-Adha and Ramadan, and special cultural events. In the 1930s, significant numbers of non-Muslim African Muslims began to convert to Islam. In 1939, Dawud Ahmed Faisal, an immigrant to the USA, born in 1891 to a Muslim family of Caribbean and Moroccan background, founded the Islamic Propagation Center of America in a former mansion at 143 State Street in Brooklyn Heights. In this building, the State Street Mosque served as a major center for Sunni Muslims in New York for many years. Today, those who react against the erection of mosques in predominantly non-Muslim communities as provocative symbols of cultural alienation and sources of social discord do so in the face of the historical record. For early Muslim immigrant communities in Australia, Britain, Canada, the United States of America and elsewhere, their local mosques served as a modest loci of integration which instilled Islamic values of justice, hard work, social harmony and collaboration. They were bridges facilitating the transition between older and new homelands and cultures, and not of segregation.